Hey, you guys, welcome back. We're discussing the history of the Columbia Gorge today with Dan Spatz. And Dan, before we went to the break, you were talking about the Lady Washington and the replica that not often, but does sail the Columbia River to this day. Let's kind of pick up from there. So let's go from there.
What happened next?
Yeah.
Well, Captain Gray established kind of a tenuous foothold to the American presence in the Oregon country with his discovery of the Columbia River. There were competing claims. England had a claim also. So it was important to solidify that. That's where the Lewis and Clark expedition came in. And as background to this whole discussion, let's talk about the Hudson's Bay Company. Here was a massive company chartered in the 1600s by Great Britain. There are actually two companies, Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Company, that have been consolidated. The regional headquarters here, it was called the Rocky Mountain District, I believe, was centered at Fort Vancouver under Chief Factor John McLaughlin in later years.
And they were actually even like over on the coast prior to that, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And what they were doing, the fur trade. The fur trade is what brought them here. A pelt that would sell for 25 cents had magnified in value 6 times over by the time it reached the coast itself. And you go ahead and trade that in England, in China rather, in Canton, for tea, bring the tea back to Great Britain, you've made an enormous profit. So the fur trade was gold at that point. This is the interest that drove the Hudson's Bay Company into this region. Now you had a completely competing set of interests from the United States. They were interested in fur, of course they were. We were interested in gold, we were interested in all sorts of things, agriculture. But immigration via the Oregon Trail was a driving influence in the American concept of what lay ahead of us for the Oregon Territory. So on the one hand, the Hudson's Bay Company was trying to sustain that trade with the Native American population without displacing that population.
Okay.
American settlement was based on the concept of some sort of a coexistence, however that might be. And what ended up happening was the reservation system. So, as background for that whole thing, back up just a little bit. Gray established a tentative presence through the discovery of the Columbia River. Thomas Jefferson commissioned Lewis and Clark in 1805, 1806 to strengthen that and to establish a permanent presence here and a permanent claim to the Oregon Territory. It did not happen overnight. Hudson's Bay Company actually had a base in the Dalles 1828 to 1830.
Really?
Those years were approximate. They had about 8 or 9 people. There was a Scottishman by the name of Birney who was the leader of that trading post here in the Dalles. So, 3 decades.
What were they doing at the trading post in the Dalles? They were doing the fur here.
They were doing the fur.
Okay.
They were trying to maintain that Great Britain presence in the Oregon Territory.
Okay.
Well, Lewis and Clark had already been there in 1805, 1806. So we had this, it wasn't an armed conflict, but it was a diplomatic conflict going on between the United States, the young United States, and Great Britain. America had purchased Spain's claim to the Oregon country at that point. So from here forward, we had to find some resolution. Who was going to control the current states of Oregon and Washington? The Treaty of 1846 was the turning point. That turned over the Oregon country to the United States, to America. And from then forward, we continued with the Oregon Trail immigration. The first settlers to reach the Dalles, the end of the Oregon Overland Trail, occurred in 1843.
Okay.
The Barlow Trail opened in 1847, going over south of Mount Hood. I want to back up a little bit and talk about the end of the Oregon Trail versus the end of the Overland Oregon Trail.
Okay, good point.
The destination for the settlers was Oregon City, but the immediate destination was the Dalles. The Dalles was the decision point. At that point, they confronted a really tough choice. There were no roads. They could break their wagons apart, they could form rafts and try to get down the Columbia River alive, or they could attempt the Barlow Road beginning in 1847 and attempt to go over those cliffs.
And either option were very, very treacherous.
Was kind of tough.
Yeah.
Was kind of tough at that point.
Yeah.
So we continued, and settlement continued, leading to the creation of Fort Dalles. With the Treaty of 1855, I should say the treaties of 1855, these were the agreements with the Native American populations that established the reservation system that continues today. These were largely artificial constructs. We put what had been hereditary enemies together in reservations, and that was not necessarily a good policy move. It
right.
was, but we were taking remnant populations By this time, the Native American population had been decimated, and more so, by measles, by smallpox. When Lewis and Clark came through, villages had already been all but annihilated. When Chief Factor McLaughlin tried to conduct a census of the Native American population, he estimated upwards of 80 to 90% had died in these various...
Really?
Yes, in the plagues of the early 19th century, the first half of the 19th century. So there were remnant populations, remnant languages. There were Native American languages as unrelated as Chinese and English, to give you an idea of the vast dimensions of the diversity of cultures that were here. And so the reservation system, we're taking these vastly different cultures and plopping together on a few different sets of land.
Yeah.
There was unrest.
Yeah.
There was
to say the least,
understandably,
I'm sure. Yeah.
Understandably. There was an uprising, there were several uprisings, and Fort Dow's Museum now, Fort Dow's at that time, also known as Camp Drum and various other titles, was established around 1854 and up through into the 1860s as a peacekeeping mechanism here in the Dalles, an attempt to maintain the peace between the settlers and the Native American population. From here, expeditions set out in all directions, particularly when there were major uprisings going into the 60s, 1870s. But that continued, and we know the outcome of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the meantime, we had settlement. We had the discovery of gold in the 1870s. We had the development of railroads, and before that, of steamships and steam passage in the Columbia Gorge. And I want to get back to a couple of modern points. If you want to learn more about that, visit places like the Discovery Center or the Columbia Gorge Interpretive Center in Stevenson, Hood River Museum. There are all sorts of places where you can learn more about these early days.
Yeah, great resources for actually, and very hands-on in many ways. I mean, you actually can get face-to-face with some of the things that you're talking about.
You can indeed. You can get that.
Yeah.
Here's how it really looked.
Absolutely. Well, want to keep this going. We got another segment coming up. So,
okay.
You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back here. We're discussing the history of the Columbia Gorge on Localite.